Hi, I'm Woo-Young Chung. I'm delighted that you decided to join us for this session. Data mesh, it's a relatively new concept, but yet it is an intriguing and promising idea in our field. In today's session, our distinguished speaker will be discussing and sharing with us his insight on data mesh. Without further ado, I turn it over to Joe.
Hi, Woo Young. Thank you very much for having me at MIT. Once again, I think this is about my 6th or so, 7th year, maybe. Welcome and glad to be back. I am going to talk a little bit about data mesh, describe what it is, what it isn't, what you need as a CDO to try to implement it and make it successful. A quick qualification about myself. Why am I here? Been invited back to MIT about over half a dozen years. It's an honor to be here. And I am the author of, co-author of the Data Warehouse ETL Toolkit, written a long time ago, but still very, very relevant when it comes to preparing data for analytics. I am also the founder and CEO of Caserta. We're a consultancy that focuses purely on providing data solutions. Been at it for about, within the company, about 20 years. I've been doing data for about 35 years. So across the country, across the world, international speaker on the topic, educator and consultant. What I'm talking about, when it comes to data solutions, I have over 150 projects under my belt. So I feel fairly qualified to talk about what we're talking about. So let's dive into it. So I found this old picture of centralized development. This is a picture before Henry Ford introduced the assembly line to the car manufacturing business. Right, so the way it used to work is, suppliers would bring all of the materials needed to make a car. Everybody would rally around the car and start putting the parts on all at the same time, all in the same place. And the consumer was on a big, long wait list, falling asleep, waiting for their car order. There's been a lot of advancement in technology around data for the last decade or so, since the introduction of quote unquote big data and object data stores and the cloud and Hadoop, and the entire data ecosystem has changed a lot. But if we really look at how are we approaching data within our organization, in a lot of organizations, probably 99% of them, we're still doing centralized development. We still have a centralized IT organization. We are working closely with the CDO. Most developers don't report up to the CDO. And then, the consumer is, usually putting in requests for data and then waiting for that data to be provided to them. And it's not working. And I think the reason why data mesh is a possibility is because this is not a technical problem. This is not even really an architecture problem, even though data mesh is called an architecture. It's not really an architecture problem. The way data ecosystems, modern contemporary data ecosystems are being built today, if they're done in a modern contemporary way, on the cloud, it's pretty close to supporting the needs of data mesh. There are gaps, and that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about exactly what is it, exactly what are the gaps, and how do you close the chasm in order to be successful. And also, what do you need to decide? What are the decisions you need to make to figure out if data mesh is even right for you, right? So the promised land is to be able to put in a request for data and get that data back, instantaneously. That's the promised land, right, of data mesh. Instead of having a centralized development organization, we're distributing the responsibility and the accountability for data across the suppliers and consumers. But it's not that easy, right? There still needs to be mastered data, centralized common data elements. The way I like to think about it is, in order to make a product, you still need to have, kind of a warehouse where you get the parts for that product. And before they enter the warehouse, they're quality assured. And then after they're assembled, they're quality assured. And then the consumer can actually use them. So I'll give you the first challenge with data mesh. So data mesh concept is based on a product. The challenge with using data mesh as a concept for data within your organization is the experience of the finished good isn't really the challenge, right? It needs work, don't get me wrong, and we'll talk about what's wrong with it and how to fix it. But the real challenge is the construction of the data and the construction of the product. And that's the part that really needs fixing. And data mesh does address that. And we'll talk about where and when. But from what I've seen so far, there's a lot of growth opportunity in that space of automating the construction of your data. And I'm going to dive fairly deep into exactly how to do that. So let's talk about what it is. So first thing is that data mesh decided that one of the design principles is to not have a monolithic data store that's the be all to end all to the entire organization. Organize your data into domains. Expect that it's going to come from different sources, and it's going to be delivered with different context, right? Accept that. That is a reality. There's no argument there. The principles behind data mesh, 100% spot on. Decentralize the ownership of development of the data and the data products, right? That is true. We do need, if everyone is going to the same small data organization within your company, it's naturally going to be a bottleneck. It's always been a bottleneck. And unless there's some kind of really pervasive change in the way we do things, it's always going to be a bottleneck. So I'm fully supportive of the principles behind data mesh. Data mesh, it comes from software design, right? The way you develop software is being adopted to be used for data mesh. Self-service design, platform design, product thinking about everything as a product, and evolving the architectures that we have today. The evolution of data architectures has been ever changing, right? It's been really, we've been using data within organizations for decades. I think in the last decade, we've evolved more than all of the other decades where it's been alive combined, right? And I predict if data mesh takes off, it's going to evolve even more, right? Within, probably within the next few short years, we won't even need a decade to see some really advanced changes in the way we do things. The concept is evangelized, and I really hope I pronounce her name right because I respect her incredibly, and I've never heard anyone say her name with an American accent yet. So I think the way you say her name is Zhamak Dagani, and Zhamak is a great speaker, great thinker. She actually works for a competitor, but that's okay. She works for ThoughtWorks. ThoughtWorks is another consulting firm, very much like Caserta. Martin Fowler works for ThoughtWorks. I personally believe Martin Fowler is probably one of the most prolific thinkers and thought leaders in the industry today. And if he's happy to call ThoughtWorks home, they must be a pretty good firm. So, so I have no qualms with promoting our competitors. It takes more than a single firm to solve some of these problems. Let's talk about the maturity of data mesh. So data mesh, it's really new, right? Even in a world where, you know, all of the technology around data is fairly nascent, right? Only a few years old. It's even new compared to that. ThoughtWorks themselves, as of November of 2019, so ThoughtWorks, they have a fairly nice classification of technologies. They break them up into 4 categories called the ThoughtWorks radar. First is investigate, second is to assess, third is to put it to trial, and then the fourth is to adopt. They're not even though they are basically the advocates for data mesh, it's not in adopt mode yet, as far as I know. It's still in trial mode. The only literature out about data mesh is not even released yet. Zhamak wrote the book on how to do it. It's due out in January. She's been releasing a few pages at a time, which is great, something to look forward to. But currently, last I checked, there's only about 30 pages released. So, so I'm going to talk about also like what's the part that we really need to know about, because a lot of it is very similar to what we're doing today. Architecturally, organizationally, it's very, very, very different. We'll talk about that as well. Also on the internet, you'll find that when you research data mesh, there's a lot of clickbait out there. There's a lot of people just regurgitating the, you know, what Zhamak has been saying. Not a whole lot of thought put into it. I'm going to try to be really thoughtful based on my own personal experience dealing with it. Lots of vendors trying to jump on a bandwagon to generate sales. But also the most telling thing that I see on the internet is that there's a lot of people out there just wondering, how do you implement this? You know, we're being told that approach it like you're approaching software. And software is deployed very, very iteratively in a very agile way. When you're dealing with data, that's not so easy, you know, because a lot of the data needs to be conformed in order to do integrated holistic analysis. And when you need that, it's hard to do just a little bit of conforming, right? You need to really conform it first. So how do I implement this in a limited release is one of the biggest questions I see on the internet. Hopefully her book will talk more about that. Okay, so what is it not? So it's definitely not a product. It's not a development methodology, a software development methodology. It's not a set of technologies. Most of the technologies that you have, assuming you're on the cloud, even if you're not on the cloud, we'll talk about what you'd have to do, but it's not out of the question to have a data mesh implementation on-prem. It's definitely not an off-the-shelf product. It's not a playbook, and it's definitely not simple. It will be the most disruptive thing you've ever done in your organization if you choose to do it. So what problem does it solve? So after like listening to Zhamak many times, I'm gonna put myself out there and say this. It's really unfortunate. It sounds like her experience with her clients, she's walked into some really bad data warehouse implementations. And so, you know, rather than refactor the data warehouse, putting the data mesh philosophy and architecture on top of it has been like her go-to solution. And so, you know, if you have like a fully functional data ecosystem on the cloud, you know, that works, you know, you may not need a data mesh. But if you have like pre-cloud tech data warehouses, you know, big Inman style, monolithic, all-in-one data warehouse, fully modeled, you may want to consider migrating off of that to data mesh technology. Even, it says pre-cloud, but even, many organizations just over the years have lifted and shifted their monolithic data warehouse, put it in Snowflake or something. It's still a monolithic pre-cloud data warehouse. It just happens to be on the cloud, right? So if that's your world, if you have a poorly architected data lake, one of the really big problems with data lakes is that people started just dumping data into Hadoop and then moving it over to S3. No real architecture behind it, a disaster. Doesn't mean data lakes are bad. It just means the way they're implemented have been bad. So if you have a well-designed data lake where your consumers can actually go browse the data catalog, find the data sets they need and use it, it's probably, data mesh. Either you don't need it at all, or evolving towards it's going to be fairly straightforward and simple. So the next two are probably the biggest hurdles that you will have to overcome. Data mesh philosophy says you don't use a centralized IT for data development, right? You still need centralized IT. And the one nice thing that that data mesh is accepting is that distributed development is not the same thing as or decentralized development is not the same thing as decentralized infrastructure. They believe that you still need centralized infrastructure. You still need centralized management of your infrastructure. But when you start developing your data products, that can start to be distributed. It's also challenging centralized data governance. It wants you to embrace federated data governance, where some of the rules for things like master data, common data elements, those can be centralized. But when you are creating a fit for purpose data product for your part of the organization, we should be able to federate that governance to your part of the organization. I do believe that is one of the biggest bottlenecks, centralized data governance today in the data world. The challenge is, where do you draw the line? And there's, if it's in her book, awesome, but there's no standards on where that is right now. Should it be, governed centrally? Should it be governed in a federated manner by a consumer? There's no clear divide yet. So that's really the biggest caution, I think, in data mesh. So when we say treat data as a product, right, it makes a lot of sense, but what does it really mean? So I'll go through a list of what I think and what I've heard. So I think number one, clearly define data ownership. So who owns the product? Who's responsible for the product? Who's accountable, right? That's the word that I really like to use with data mesh, is having someone held accountable for the quality of that product. That's something that's usually missing in corporate America. Everyone wants to say, that's my data. But as soon as there's something wrong with it, they say, oh, that's somebody else's fault. Right. So if data mesh does nothing else besides come up with a way to hold people accountable for quality of the data that they consider theirs, that's a big win, right, in corporate America. Align data for the different business uses. Have happy customers. Make the data discoverable. Make it very easily consumable, just as if you were like picking products and putting it in your shopping cart on Amazon, right? That easy. We want to have like the most atomic level, field level data available, and also aggregates without making it a project, right? That's a big goal. Have it understandable, well documented in a catalog, browsable with examples so that you can see if it's really the data you're looking for. Have it credible and trustworthy, and have the lead time between data requests and data availability as low as possible. Right? Those are the goals. So here's the opportunity for you. In order to do all these things, you're going to have to change your corporate organization. You're going to have to change your corporate culture. You're going to have to embrace distributed data ownership. You're going to have product owners really held accountable for their data assets. And as of right now, you're going to have to create some technologies to support the success of this idea, because the technology just isn't there yet. It's buildable, right? But you can't go by, can I have the data mesh module in that product, please? It doesn't exist yet. So one thing that I fear, I actually found this slide that I created back in like the 90s, right? You know, where when I was talking about using dimensional bus matrix in order to have a consolidated view of your data through the build out of independent marts, right? So using conformed dimensions, standardized facts, right? That was the answer back then. Some will argue that that's still the answer. But before that, right, before you know, the methodology from my book was embraced, you know, customers were going out, finding their data, writing their own ETL processes, building their own marts, and having their own data assets. Very little governance, no standards. It was really messy, right? And that's why data warehouses started to become more and more prolific throughout the corporate America, pervasive throughout corporate America. When I hear people talk about data mesh, it's starting to sound like all they're doing is they're changing the words and the labels of these things and calling the sources domains, calling the ETL processes data alignment, calling the different data marts aggregates, and calling the end users consumers. This is not what Zhamak is intending. I just want to be clear. Everything that I've seen and read about, you know, her message is not this, right? This will bring us back to where we were 30 years ago. This is not a data mesh. So what is a data mesh? So polyglot inputs, you know, this is what she calls, she affectionately called this, I think, the bug in her early videos, because it kind of looks like one, not because it's a coded bug, right? But you know, it's essentially a node within the mesh, and each node represents a product, and a product could be an element, it could be an aggregate, it could be you know, output of a data model, of a predictive model, right? It could be anything that you can call data, right? Has many inputs, has many outputs, you know, different consumers, different suppliers, and none of that is new so far, right? We've been doing this for a long time. What's new and what's exciting about data mesh is her concept of control ports. So what a control port is, it's saying, let's stop like spending 6 months coding data pipelines in ETL, in Python, in you know, Informatica, Data Stage, Matillion, whatever, right? Let's stop doing that, right? Let's stop writing code. Let's stop having a centralized team of developers. Every time there's a new request, start building new pipelines to satisfy that request. The concept is to have a control port, which essentially, think of it as a big giant configuration file. And that big giant configuration file is going to be a mixture of data, metadata, and code. And if we can do this right, this is the answer, right? If we can do this right, having an environment where there are standards in place, templates in place, canonical control port APIs, where anyone who wants data, anyone who supplies data can actually go through the control port with data and code and and ensure the quality and ensure the usage and the user access, all the things that we care about, in a very managed way. That's the promise, right? From what I've seen so far, this part is not fully baked yet. This part is the greatest opportunity. Clients that I've seen doing this, they're rolling their own control port methodology. There's no standards yet. Hopefully the book will have the standards, but this is the big opportunity here. If we can pull this off, if control ports can become modern architect, a part of the modern data ecosystem, this will be a huge stride and advancement in the data world. So what is inside that control port? So we want that to be the product blueprint, right? So what exactly does it need to look like? How do you create it? How do you unify it with other systems? Make it discoverable, automate the access control layer of the data, be able to, based on the data, know where to put it, right? Should it be persistent? Should it be immutable? Should it be NoSQL? Should it be relational? All of that should be configurable in the control port. SLOs, so the service level objective, right? So what is the promise by the supplier for that data? And then what does the consumer actually need of that data? And be able to have a contract between the supplier and the consumer, and monitor whether that contract is actually being complied or not complied with. That's a really big ask, right? That is the part that the biggest opportunity, I think. We have clients who have built this with our help, but I have not seen anything in the market yet to do this. Pipeline orchestration, data products, CI/CD, and then automated governance. I've been advocating automated governance actually since the beginning of the pandemic. This was something that I started, so about 18 months in now from the beginning of the pandemic. I do believe that this is something, the manual processes associated with data governance today is killing us. It does not need to be manual anymore. This is part of, even if data mesh does not get adopted, this has to get adopted. Being able to bake data governance policies into your data ecosystem, whether you call it a control port or not. So the opportunity is that there's no products out there that do all of these things. We will have to build it, right? At least for now. The data mesh concept is based on software, right? It was Zhamak and even Martin Fowler. They're all software engineers. And they took, it's really great to have somebody from outside looking in with a fresh set of eyes saying, you data guys, you're doing it wrong, right? That's cool, right? That is great. It's great to be challenged. But here's the challenge with that, right? Data is not a software. It's not software, and it's so far, it's not code. But everything that we need in order to deal with data, right? To create it, to discover it, to secure it, to access it, to move it, to clean it, to govern it, to model it, to store it, to integrate it, to deploy it, to consume it. You do need code in order to do all those things, right? So code is, you can't have data without code, right? And the concept of data as code is starting to become a thing. And you can Google it, but data as code. I think this is not, one of Zhamak's concepts, but I believe that this will help expedite the acceptance of data mesh if this happens, because in order for the producers to be able to say, right, without manual intervention, In order for them to say, this is how the data needs to be consumed, this is how it needs to be cleansed, right? All of the rules that we talked about in that control port, in order for all of that to be communicated, you need to be able to attach the code to the data, right? All of these things that you want to do that requires code needs to become part of the data, right? So data will become part of that code, and that has to happen, I think. My own personal opinion, that has to happen in order for this to really work. There's a company called, again, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Arito. I'm not even going to try to pronounce Constantino's last name, but you know, what they're trying to do is create a product that has and services that has data as code. Right, and the way he describes it, it's the ability to process, manage, consume, share data in the same way that we do for code, right, in software development. So they want to be able to, the concept is to automate everything associated with your data, all the things that we're doing, lineage, the version of your data, right? The biggest challenge is like, how did it look, you know, when we closed the books last month versus today, right? Every time data changes. Just like take the concept of every time your software code changes, right? It's versioned, it's stored, it's in GitHub, and you can go find it. How did it look at that moment, right? The same concept is starting to evolve for data. And then, you know, and then the secure access is probably one of the most important parts. I haven't seen a whole lot about that in the data mesh literature yet. Hopefully that's coming soon. But you know, approach with caution. The concept of data as code is, as far as I know, is even newer than the concept of data mesh, which is pretty damn new. All right, so how do we do this? All right, you're going to need some of the following. Data mesh for now, right? It's not for the faint of heart. You will need consultants. You will need people who've done it at least once. And you're going to need fairly sophisticated users, you know, data consumers, at least for now. You're going to have to accept that you are surrendering to centralized control and development over your data organization. You're going to accept that you're going to federate your data governance processes. You need well-defined, permissive IT governance practices. So that means, you know, you need to be able to have an environment where you can very quickly give data to somebody, put it in a sandbox, and let them use it, right? In an automated way. You need to be able to have infrastructure that's going to support all these things. You're going to have an environment where you can inherently secure your data based on the supplier's wishes and the consumer's needs, right? And know how to mitigate that, mediate that when they don't always agree, right? And then the segregation of data quality accountability. I think this is a pretty big problem. You know, producers only care about their world, right? If you talk to, you know, the claims people and say that, you know, the member, the way you're describing member doesn't comply with the way the marketing department describes their member, they're going to say, I don't care. I need to process claims, right? So figuring out where's that line, how do you master it, who's accountable for unified data and consolidated data, that's it's not easy. It's very political, it's very emotional, it's very all about control. And you know, if anyone else saw me speak, I talked about the data therapist. This definitely requires some data therapy to get people to really come to terms with what's going on here. And I also want to stress again, decentralized control and development does not mean decentralized infrastructure. You know, having a single place and a single framework and a single group of people responsible for the CI/CD frameworks, identity and access control, your security, threat monitoring. All of that doesn't change, right? That needs to be, especially if you're in a regulated environment. So why do I focus so much on quality? This is also something I wrote back in 2004, 2003 maybe. Based on my experience over the years, data quality is what slows down data access. And there's no easy answer, right? The concept of data mesh says put the onus on the supplier, right? It's not always that easy, right? And if you don't put the onus on the supplier, how's it get fixed? The thought that data mesh is going to eliminate ETL, I don't see it. At some point, the data still needs to be cleaned, conformed, consolidated, right? It still needs to happen at some point. Now, there are different techniques, new technologies to make it much, much easier, make it virtual. But at the end of the day, all those things still have to happen somewhere, right? Those, what I call the political DMZ between category B and C, those arguments are still going to happen, right? If data mesh does anything, if it can solve that problem, where the accountability of a data defect is like very clearly assigned, and there's accountability and ramifications, like then it's a huge win. Nothing else really matters. But this is not something that's trivial. This is dealing with people. Technology is easy. Dealing with people is really hard. So far, all I've seen is concepts, plans. There's not a whole lot of technology to support it yet. Not a whole lot of action out there so far. This is not the first time someone came up with an idea on a better way to do it. Until we really figure out tangible assets to use in order to implement data mesh, it's going to be another one on this slide. We need to figure out how to do it, and in data, the only way to do it is to do it. We need to figure this out. One of the reasons why the Hadoop world back in the day took off like hockey stick growth is because all the data was open source. So everybody was able to see what's going on. Everybody was able to contribute to it and make it usable really fast, right? So nascent became production, right, pretty much overnight back in, from 2009 to 2011. We probably need something like that in order for data mesh to take off. So what technologies are out there today and what technologies are needed? I do think that, if you Google data mesh, all the data virtualization tools are at the top of your Google page one. They are jumping on this bandwagon. Maybe this will make them see, their day in the sun, but it's not the ultimate solution, and it's definitely not the holistic solution. If you have fairly simplistic data integration challenges, data virtualization could be a viable solution for part of the data mesh. Technologies like Presto, Trino, and then all of the new labels from all of the different cloud providers that do the same thing. Those I think are absolutely needed. Open source Apache Ranger, it could be a good way to deliver some of this. Basically what we want to do is we want to simplify anything that is physically writing code to physically change data and then move it or place the answer in another persistent layer, right? All of that IO just takes time. All of the transformations take time. And the goal is to get to the finish line faster. If you are not on the cloud, good luck with this. It's not impossible. There are many big banks who have essentially all the cloud technologies that the cloud would have, but they've spent years investing in those technologies. If you don't have all of those assets, things like, containerization and boundaries, unified logging, monitoring, object data stores, and you want to go data mesh, moves to the cloud, all that stuff comes for free. So, so I do think that this really is a cloud solution, although, you know, have at it if you want to resist the cloud. I think innovation around data catalogs in order to do things like data lineage implicitly, right? You know, SLO contracts between producers and consumers. I think that this is a great opportunity for them to evolve and become the heart of a data mesh answer, right, solution. More things that I think are needed in general in the organization, in the industry rather, but I think if the goal is to say, I need some data and I want it now, here's the stuff that I think would really make, you know, call it data mesh or just call it really optimize, you know, data delivery, right? I think the thought of manually going out and discovering data, doing data profiling, looking at schemas, like all of this stuff should just be codified. We're not splitting atoms anymore. We know how to do this stuff with code. I think all of this should be, you should be able to discover anytime a new data asset is created anywhere in your corporate, in your company. We should be able to just have the data ecosystem be aware of it and be able to deliver it to consumers that want it. I do think also that if we think about how we build data pipelines today, we are going through and looking at the data, figuring out how to join it, figuring out how to unify it. We're visually looking at it, looking for patterns. Machines are really, really good at looking at patterns in data, right? And coming up with recommendations on how to unify it. The fact that this is not already standard operating procedure, it just blows my mind. This has to happen. Tamr is one of the products that do okay at this, but there's tremendous opportunity to do it better out in the industry. Data unification using artificial intelligence, more the same. I do believe that as a data consumer, if I'm doing anything more than asking a question of my data in a chat line, in a search bar, it's too complicated, right? In today's world where, you know, most business leaders are millennials and they were born with a smartphone in their hand, anything more than a Google search bar for data is too complicated. We need to really, really simplify it and make that product readily available. Data delivery, data literacy, and what I call data adoption programs throughout the entire organization. Us, you know, everybody on this call as data nerds, we get it. Everybody trying to get through the day doing their job, they don't get it, right? I think for data mesh and advancement of data analytics throughout an organization to advance, you need to be very intentional about, you know, data literacy, data adoption, and data therapy, right? Analytics maturity models, figuring out where you are in all of this and having roadmaps on how to get to where you need to be. I do think that is something that most companies need to invest in to figure out how to get to data mesh, or at least a more advanced way of thinking about data. This is usually done by outside consulting firms because it gets very political. So having an outside point of view without any emotional attachment to what exists today is mandatory. So yeah, that typically takes consulting, as does trying to figure out how to monetize the products that you're creating. Usually in concert, right? You need somebody with the fresh ideas. Just like the reason why data mesh is so great, is because people who were not really data people, they were more software engineers, they took a look at it. When you have a consultant come in that's not part of your day-to-day operation, come take a look at your data, they'll have the ideas that they've seen throughout the industry on how you can actually monetize your data. As data mesh starts to mature, We're already starting to see the convergence of data and digital, but I think this will expedite that convergence. Data engineering, data analytics, data science, all of that needs to be optimized through automation and AI. And then once we have all of this, those data products, right? Those Zhamak bugs that she calls them, the data product nodes, those need to start being embedded in tangible products that are either consumed internally or consumed externally. So summary. So one thing's for sure, right? No one can question the request and wait mentality in the data world is no longer acceptable, right? No one is standing for it, which is why we have shadow IT departments all over our organization, because they're just doing it themselves. Data mesh challenges the status quo, desperately needed to challenge the status quo. So I'm a big fan of anything that challenges the status quo. The only way to do it is to move it. Let's keep moving forward. You will still need to model your master data and model all of your common data elements and have those in your warehouse pick, inventory. Think of the robots that go through the warehouse at Amazon and pick the product that's in the order and then go put it, on the delivery dock. That still needs to happen, right? We just need to get better at it, automate it more. Make it more like configuration based, right? Using the control port. Data mesh depends on a unified metadata model, as far as I can tell. There still needs to be some standardization on how we're configuring those control ports in order for this to really go throughout the industry without everybody rolling their own way of doing things. Think about data linking versus data transforming, most of the time, still with master data and common data elements. I think we are still transforming, in order to make them readily available by all of the other data consumers. But if we think about linking versus transforming, that drastically reduces the latency. And so now that if you think about that, that really opens up to a whole different set of things, right? Things like data vault, right? Data vault, the whole concept behind data vault is like, stop changing all of your data, just link it all together, right? Through the link tables. And then also graph, right? Instead of like trying to conform all your data physically, put it all in a graph and then have the links in the graph so that you can find the version of the data that you want when you need it. Data as code, I think, is something that is going to expedite the maturity of data mesh, my personal opinion. Data management of your organization is going to need to change. That's probably the biggest challenge, is getting people who've been doing the same thing the same way their entire career and saying, yeah, that doesn't really work for us anymore. We got to completely change the way you do things. That's hard, right? Again, that's where your data therapist comes in. The culture has to change. And that's where, data adoption, data literacy, all those programs have to be very intentional. This is not a technical problem. This is a very, very emotional, political, organizational problem, right? And it needs to be challenged. I mean, it needs to be approached and addressed with sensitivity and empathy for the people who are involved. Data mesh is in its infancy, even in, where nascent products and nascent technologies are the norm in our world lately. It's an infant compared to that, right? So approach with caution. And also the line between centralized, what should be centralized, what should be decentralized. I have not seen any standards on this yet. They need to be really thought through and made public so that people could start following it. So some questions to ask yourself. Can I sell this to my CXO board, CXOs and the board? It's a big change throughout your entire organization without buy-in at the C-level, it's never going to happen, in my opinion. Can my organization or your organization move to a federated data governance model? Do you have the talent that's required to do this? Is your organization capable of like really changing all the time? Lots of change, right? There's going to be a lot of failure. The failure hopefully will be fast and corrected, but it's going to be a very fast evolution process. You know, a lot of big giant organizations just can't do that, right? It's like it's trying to maneuver the Titanic. It just doesn't work. And is your organization comfortable being on the edge? You know, if you're heavily regulated, maybe not, you know, so something to ask yourself. And all things considered, hopefully as a result of this talk, think about, is it really the best option, or is it just something different and something new? And hopefully with these questions, you'll convince yourself yes or no for your organization. So that's all I got. If anyone has any questions for me, feel free to reach out to me directly. You can email me at joe.caserta@caserta.com. The organization that I built does all of the things we talked about: data literacy, data strategy, data architecture, cloud transformation, data engineering, data orchestration, monetization, and advanced analytics. So if you need any help, feel free to reach out. We have a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to open up the chat. Okay, here's a question. Oh, lots of questions. Cool. If data is a product, is the CDO the product manager? I think the answer is no. I think the CDO is the organizer of the entire paradigm shift, right? But I think that the product manager is the person that is responsible for the construction and consumption of the data. That's what I think. There's going to be so many different. It's like, you know, if you know, with any company that creates products, right? There's no single product manager, right? Every product has a manager. And I think that in the data mesh philosophy, each one of those nodes could potentially have a manager, right? And I think that's the answer. The CDO is the umbrella above the product managers, if you will. Control ports, APIs sound like the pattern of microservices in software. Should we look to microservice software development patterns for best practices? That is Nate Rakowitz. Thank you, Nate. Good to hear from you. I'd say yes. You know, I think that unless we're told otherwise, that sounds like a pretty good answer. You know, I do think that it is microservices based, but I also think the data as code, it's probably maybe a combination of those two things, which would be a great place to start for looking for design patterns of your control ports. What are some of the challenges you foresee with control port? Jay Shanker said that. I think that until I see standards on how to do it, I think it's going to become the Wild West. It could very easily become unmanageable. I think unless there's centralized standards, maybe not centralized, you know, content within the ports, right? But a population of the content. But I think the port concept itself, you know, if the way I like to think of it, just a big configuration file, right? Here's all the things that need to be done with this data, and here's exactly how to do it, right? Unless there's a standard for that, you know, the danger is different product owners are going to come up with their own way to do it, and it's going to be impossible to manage. And so I think until we see some standards, it's going to be a challenge. Data mesh versus data fabric concept. How do you see these as the same or different? I see data fabric more as like an infrastructure and data mesh more as the organization around the infrastructure. That's my personal opinion. I think that the data ecosystem, you know, in modern, contemporary, cloud-based solutions are the impetus for the or the foundation for the fabric, right, of data throughout your organization. I think in order for that to be executed properly, the data mesh concepts need to be applied. That's the way I think about it. So that's all I got. I'll turn it back over to Woo Young. Thank you very much for having me and indulging me.
Oh, thank you. Indeed. We really do appreciate you, your continuing participation in this symposium. We are very glad to have you back. Also, as a representative of this symposium, I would like to express our deepest appreciation for your thoughtful presentation today. Thank you. And also, I want to thank everyone who attended this session.